Welcome to the Flexible Philosophy podcast, where we sit down with leading thinkers to talk about the ways that their ideas can be put into practice. I'm your host, Hamza King, and on this episode, I'll be discussing climate displacement with Jamie Draper, Assistant Professor at the Ethics Institute in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Utrecht University and author of Climate Displacement. Thank you for being with us, and we hope you enjoy listening. In the summer of 2022, Pakistan experienced some of the most severe flooding in its history. 1.7 million homes were destroyed and around 33 million people were displaced. Pakistan accounts for only 0.9% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but is one of the top 10 countries most affected by climate change. A protection gap exists under international law for those displaced by the impacts of climate change. The 1951 Refugee Convention does not recognize the Pakistani civilians that were displaced as refugees, and the 1988 Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement offer no protections to those facing the threat of state extinction in Tuvalu, Kiribati, or the Maldives. The idea of a climate refugee treaty has been suggested as a way of filling this protection gap by outlining a set of rights for those displaced by the impacts of climate change. This treaty would be centered around the dubious concept of a climate refugee. In his new book, Jamie Draper argues against implementing a climate refugee treaty. He claims that the concept of a climate refugee is unhelpful because it obscures the complexity and heterogeneity of climate displacement and ignores the fact that there are different moral considerations which arise in different contexts of climate displacement. Now, Jamie, I actually wrote my master's thesis on your book and spent many hours going through each page, so I'm very excited to have you on here to chat.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here, and it's great to hear that you engaged with my book for your thesis, although slightly intimidating to hear that you've gone through every page, but I'm looking forward to chatting about it.
Why don't you start by saying a bit about why you decided to write a book on climate displacement, a topic which has only recently started to attract the attention of political philosophers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're right that it's a small kind of literature. I think that was also a big part of the challenge of working in this area, is that you don't really have like a well mapped out terrain of arguments to deal with. So part of the aim of the book really is to do this kind of mapping exercise for political philosophers to think about what are the kind of key moral questions when it comes to climate change and displacement. And so although I do try and give some arguments in the book about what I think we should do in relation to these different kinds of issues, a large part of the motivation for the book was really to get a handle on what these kind of key questions are in the first place. So as you said, a lot of philosophers have kind of reached for this concept of the climate refugee as a kind of readily available way of understanding the relationship between climate change and displacement. But it's really striking to me, looking at the empirical literature on the relationship between climate change, displacement, migration, that this is really not the way that it's understood from a kind of empirical point of view, that it's actually a lot more diverse as a phenomenon, a lot more causally complex than this picture would suggest. And so this disconnect between the sort of philosophical work that was just starting on this topic and the empirical work was a large part of the motivation for writing the book as well.
Okay, well, one might respond here by saying that although the concept of a climate refugee has its shortcomings, in practical terms, a climate refugee treaty still seems to be the best available mechanism for filling the protection gap under international law. So if a climate refugee treaty could help safeguard the rights of those displaced by the floods in Pakistan, for example, why do you think it would be such a bad idea?
So I think this idea is well-intentioned, and I also think it's probably better than nothing. But I don't think it's the first best approach that we should be reaching for when it comes to climate change and displacement. So there are a couple of problems that I think it faces. And I should say I'm not the first one to point out these problems. Some international lawyers have had a similar response to this proposal. So one problem, I think, is that a climate refugee treaty looks a bit like a kind of one-size-fits-all approach for displacement due to climate change. But when it comes to displacement driven by climate change, one size just doesn't fit all, right? So climate displacement could involve internal displacement in the aftermath of extreme weather events, could involve planned relocation projects within countries, could involve international labour-related migration, and it could look more like the sort of classic forms of refugee movement that we're more familiar with. But if we have a treaty that's focused on categorizing people who are displaced by climate change as one group with one set of rights to which they're all entitled, it's hard to say exactly what that set of rights should be, because it looks like these people in different situations might have different kinds of moral claims. Another problem is that I think that the causal complexity of climate displacement makes it very difficult practically to say who should count as a climate refugee and who shouldn't count as a climate refugee. So even if we solve this first problem, the sort of one-size-fits-all problem, there's the second problem, which is that in practice, decisions about who counts as a climate refugee are going to be very hard to make. And that's because often the impacts of climate change are kind of interconnected with all kinds of other drivers of migration and displacement, which might be political or economic or demographic, or indeed other kinds of environmental drivers. And so I think this approach is going to get us bogged down in questions of whether or not somebody's displacement was really caused by climate change, or whether it was really caused by, I don't know, the sort of economic structure in which they're situated, or the political conditions in which they find themselves. And these arguments, I think, are likely to be counterproductive, when what really matters is not whether somebody was displaced by the impacts of climate change, but whether a displaced person's needs can be best addressed through something like a climate refugee treaty, or a refugee treaty, or something else in other contexts.
Okay, so your critique really centers around the fact that climate change is spatially and temporally dispersed, which makes it difficult to attribute particular instances of displacement to climate change. A practical consequence of this is that a climate refugee treaty would fail to treat like cases alike and different cases differently. Now, I describe this part of your critique as the formal equality objection, the idea that a climate refugee treaty would be unable to distinguish between the different moral concerns raised by different types of displacement, because it takes this one-size-fits-all approach. To avoid this problem, you suggest a pluralist theory of climate displacement. Could you give a short summary of what you mean by this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so first I should say I really like the formal equality objection. I think I should have called it that in the book. So that's nice. I might take that forward. So the alternative that I propose is, if you like, to stop thinking about climate displacement as one problem and start thinking about it as many different problems. So I think that there are a range of different ways in which climate change and displacement interact. We'll talk about some of them in a minute. And that in each of these different contexts, there are just going to be different moral problems and different appropriate responses to those problems. So in a way, the alternative that I propose is somewhat deflationary, right? It says climate displacement is not one problem, but it's many problems. And there are going to be many different appropriate solutions in different kinds of contexts. That's the basic idea.
On that note then, let's get into some of the different contexts you cover in the book. The first is community relocation. That is, circumstances where entire communities are displaced by the impacts of climate change. You mentioned the Inupiaq and Yupik tribes living in northwestern Alaska, which still practice traditional hunting techniques in a bid to keep their culture and traditions alive. However, shoreline erosion and thinning permafrost are gradually making the land which these villages are located upon uninhabitable. And after the collapse of several sea defences, each community has voted to relocate. So in circumstances like these, where entire communities are uprooted by the impacts of climate change, what kind of ethical considerations do you think need to be taken into account?
So in the book, I distinguish between three ideal typical ways in which relocation decisions might take place. The first is basically by giving power and resources to individuals directly, or perhaps individual families or something like that, and saying, okay, well, look, we have a budget for relocation. We'll just divide the budget up by the number of people who are at risk here, and everybody can use their share of the budget to make their own relocation decisions. And that way, people can make decisions that reflect their own preferences, their own tastes, their own desires. They can choose to spend more if they want to remain in place for a longer period of time by investing some of that money in staying where they are, or they can make a decision to relocate to an area where their religion or cultural practices are well supported. Others can take the opportunity to change lifestyle radically and move to say, a city or something like that. So that's the kind of individual model. And I should say, I think it does have something going for it, which is that it does give individuals quite a significant space of freedom. But the problem that I think that it has is that it makes it really difficult for communities that have shared or collective interests to protect those interests together. So in the case of Shishmaref, for example, one of the real worries that the community has expressed is that different people will move away at different times, some to cities like Anchorage or Nome or something like that. And eventually the community will just sort of disperse and fade away. It will become kind of fragmented. And so I think that it's important to provide opportunities for communities to be able to stay together and to relocate collectively if they can. And this is in fact what villages like Shishmaref are trying to do at the moment. So another alternative that I look at is what I kind of call the communitarian model, which says, okay, well, it's not the individual that matters here, it's the community itself. So when we're thinking about relocation, we should be prioritizing the interests of the community, considered as a kind of collective agent. And at first glance, that looks like it kind of solves the problems that I mentioned with the individual approach. But I have another kind of worry about it, which is that it requires us to treat the community as a kind of internally undifferentiated whole, as if the community has one set of fixed or essential interests that can be protected in the process of relocation. But in practice, communities are just groups of individuals, right? There's individuals within them who have different views about how the relocation process should take place, different values, different understandings of their collective identity, and so on. And so there's a risk that if we try and prioritize the community, we'll end up prioritizing one particular vision of what the community's interests are, rather than the interests of the kind of collective group of individuals that make up the community, which is a kind of internally diverse group. Mm-hmm. And so in the end, I propose a kind of third model, which is what I call the kind of democratic model. And unsurprisingly, that involves a process of democratic deliberation and communication and negotiation in which decisions are made at the community level, but sort of through this process of individuals articulating their competing visions of the value of the community and what it should mean for the relocation process. And I sort of suggest as part of this that individuals should retain what I call a robust right of exit, which means that if there are sort of minorities within the community who don't feel that their interests are being fairly represented within the relocation process, then they can withdraw from that process as well. So nobody's kind of forced to stay as part of the community, but there is a kind of robust opportunity for communities to take decisions at the kind of collective level. So that's the story that I tell, at least, about how relocation decisions should be governed in this chapter.
Let's move on to the second area then, territorial sovereignty. And the examples you draw on here, I think these are some of the most interesting ones to people who first hear about climate displacement. And that's small island states like Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Maldives. Now, the IPCC predicts that global mean sea levels will rise by between 0.26 and 0.82 meters by 2100. And this would result in these small island states being completely submerged, and their populations will be forced to relocate. Now, the term state extinction has been used to describe this troubling prospect. I just wanted to ask you, in the event that this does happen, which is, looking more and more likely, how do you think the rights of self-determination should be preserved within these states?
Yeah, so I think you're right that this is one of the topics that sort of grabs people's attention when it comes to climate displacement. It's also one of the few topics where there's already been quite a significant philosophical body of work. There are kind of three options that I look at in the chapter. So the first is what I call territorial redistribution, which is some other state ceding or giving up some territory so that small island peoples could exercise territorial jurisdiction in the way that they currently do, just in a new place. Another is a more radical, perhaps, option, what's been called deterritorialized statehood. So this is the idea that we can have something like a self-governing state, but that doesn't govern any territory. And this would look quite different to the states that we know today, and it might involve other forms of governance, perhaps over people rather than places, right? And then the final option that I look at is what I call intrastate territorial autonomy. And this is a kind of territorial form of self-governance that's embedded within the broader structure of another state, for example, through something like a kind of federal arrangement or something like that. Although there are very different models here, which might be appropriate in different kinds of contexts. I end up defending this kind of third option, kind of intrastate territorial autonomy option, on the basis that I think that, at least if it's properly implemented, then it can provide small island peoples with an effective ability to engage in self-government, and it avoids some kind of costs that I think face the other two proposals, particularly costs about the rights of incumbent residents in areas that small island peoples would be relocated to, and the potential risk of things like conflict over territory. But this is really a kind of, be like a kind of compromise solution that aims to balance the competing claims of small island peoples to self-determination with the moral claims that residents have of areas to which small island peoples might relocate. It's a way, if you like, of trying to guarantee both the right to self-determination and to avoid some of the moral costs that might be incurred by alternative options.
I see, right. And well, just to kind of expand on one of the examples, Tuvalu, one of their proposals has been to put themselves on the metaverse. And I struggle to kind of conceptualize this, but I think, in essence, it would be each citizen having a virtual profile of sort that allows them to stay connected, even if they are potentially dispersed in different parts of the world. So Tuvalu is a small population. I think it's got about 10,000 people. And if some were to live in different regions from others, then the idea would be that these individuals could, kind of log into their online profile and maybe vote or participate in deliberative exercises, and that would help them retain some sense of national identity and perhaps, building on from the points you made earlier, some sense of self-determination. I just wanted to get your thoughts on this proposal. Do you think it's got much merit? Do you think it's something other small island states like Kiribati and the Maldives should be considering, or is it a bit fanciful?
Yeah, so I saw this proposal recently. I have to admit a kind of skepticism about it, I suppose, in the sense that I think if what we're looking for is a way to enable small island peoples to really exercise self-government, then my thought is that this is unlikely to be it, right? So perhaps members of this sort of new online community could log in together and make collective decisions and vote, but it's hard to see what they would be voting on, right? That would really affect the sort of material circumstances of their lives in a significant way. Presumably, a diasporic Tuvalu the members of that political community would still be governed by the laws of the state in which they live, right?
Yeah, of course.
And so in that sense, it doesn't look like the metaverse option would be really what we mean by collective self-determination. That being said, right, maybe that's not its primary goal. So another thing you mentioned is the idea that this might allow a diasporic community to preserve a sense of collective identity over time. If so, then, this might well be an interesting way of doing that. I'm not sure how successful the kind of metaverse will be as the particular location for that kind of collective identity building. But at the moment, I think it looks a bit sort of science fiction-y. But there are some people who do think that, sort of cloud communities will take an increasingly important role in our political lives and may eventually in the long-term future take the place of something like territorial states. For the moment, I kind of remain skeptical. I think that the core functions of political self-determination involve things like making the rules about how land use is organized, how town planning is done, what's in the criminal code and how the police should enforce the criminal code and this kind of thing. And these kinds of, if you like, competencies of self-determining political communities are, at least to some degree, I think, inevitably territorial. They're about governing the relationships between people who live side by side with each other. And so my thought, I suppose, here is that I find it hard to see how a virtual community could exercise a form of self-determination that includes these kinds of core competencies.
Yeah, I would agree with you here. I see this metaverse proposal as more of a supplementary mechanism rather than a standalone solution. But I think the media attention which small island states have attracted points to a bigger problem here, which is that there tends to be an overemphasis on these types of cases, state extinction, a big eye-catching soundbite. But the reality is that the impacts of climate change are often much more subtle and pernicious, as we can see by the third context you discuss in the book, which is labour migration. You point to the example of Ethiopia, where subsistence farmers are battling with droughts of increasing frequency and intensity, which are resulting in food shortages. Many households are using labour migration as an adaptive strategy. This involves younger members of the household migrating and taking up waged labour abroad, then sending money back to their family at home. Now, this practice is increasing across the global south. It's not just Ethiopia where subsistence farming is becoming threatened by the impacts of climate change. My question for you is whether you think states can permissibly use labour migration as a tool to adapt to climate change, and whether you think they might ever have a moral obligation to do so.
So I think you're right that this is perhaps one of the sort of less visible, especially in comparison with the small island states case. So I think this is a very interesting question because on the one hand, what I think that we ought to want to do here is to enable people to make migration decisions that improve their well-being, livelihoods, wealth, income, improve their ability to protect themselves and their communities against the impacts of climate change. But at the same time, we don't want to put them in a kind of situation where this is their only option. Otherwise, this starts to look like forced migration rather than a kind of self-help strategy that's engaged in voluntarily. So I think one key question is about under what conditions would this kind of migration be voluntary? And there I think that really the standard ought to be that migration can't be the only option for adaptation. So in communities where labour migration is a potential way of adapting to the impacts of climate change, if the only option is to engage in labour migration, then I think that we can't say that this is, or at least we can't say with confidence that this is a kind of voluntary form of migration. I don't think this rules out using labour migration policy as a tool of climate adaptation, but what I do think it means is that it has to be paired with other forms of investments in climate adaptation that enable people to stay where they are if that's what they choose to do. So I think this has to be a choice, really. So labour migration policy might have a role to play, I think, in adaptation to climate change, but I don't think it can be the only option. That being said, you mentioned before that there might be a kind of duty or a moral obligation to encourage labour migration. So I discussed this a little bit in the book. And one thing I point out is that, well, look, when it comes to adaptation options, labour migration, potentially at least, looks to be A, quite cheap, and B, quite effective in its outcomes. So we know that, for example, remittances are a hugely important source of income in many communities and enable development in many communities as well. And this gives us good reason to think that something similar could be true at the impact of remittances on promoting climate resilience. And so if labour migration is a kind of cheap option and it's a kind of effective option, then this starts to look like a case for using labour migration where possible.
So we're already starting to see here how climate displacement might create special moral obligations on affluent states who suffer least from the impacts of climate change whilst contributing to it most. And this moves us nicely onto the fourth context you discussed, which is the refugee regime. Now, there are several ways in which climate change can contribute to situations where persons have a valid claim to refugee status. The first is by driving conflict. Some social scientists have argued that the 2011 Syrian civil war was driven by prolonged drought in preceding years, which magnified existing sources of political instability around corruption, inequality, and food prices. The second is by exacerbating conditions of social deprivation. In the Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, climate change has led to significant reductions in crop yields, creating food insecurity and poverty. This drives displacement amongst the most vulnerable, who often flee to other regions to avoid being extorted by criminal gangs. The political scientist Maria Jose Mendez describes this as the silent violence of climate change. The third is by increasing the likelihood of natural disasters. Just last year, Ethiopia experienced severe famine affecting nearly 12 million people. Many people were forced to flee in search of food. Now, there are different understandings of what it means to be a refugee. You defend an interpretation which you call the membership view against the persecution view and the basic needs view. Could you elaborate on what you mean by the membership view and say a bit about what role you believe the refugee regime should play in responding to climate displacement?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing to say is that as things stand when it comes to international law, refugee status is ascribed on the basis of a reasonable fear of persecution based on certain protected characteristics such as political opinion or race or gender or nationality. So in order to qualify as a refugee, you have to meet this kind of persecution condition as well as being outside of your state of origin. Now, when it comes to climate change, there might be some cases. So you mentioned the case of Syria, for example, where climate change interacts with sort of classic forms of refugee movement. I should say that there is a huge amount of controversy amongst social scientists about the case of Syria. So yeah, I don't want to make any strong kind of causal claims here.
It's disputed, yeah.
It is, yeah, very, very highly disputed and often sensationalized, I think, in the media, the relationship between climate change and conflict. And there's a lot of sort of problems, I think, in the social scientific literature of this on this research as well. But that's getting me off topic. So there may be some cases, right, where climate change has a kind of indirect relationship to classic forms of refugee movement. But I defend a broader view of who should count as a refugee, who should have a valid moral claim to refugee status, even if they don't currently have a valid legal claim. And that view, which I call the membership view, is really about whether your state is willing and able to protect your basic rights. So we live in a kind of international state system that's based on two key norms, at least ideally. One key norm is state sovereignty, right? So states are kind of sovereign actors in international politics. The other key norm is human rights. So every individual has a certain set of basic human rights that ought to be protected, and they ought to be protected by their sovereign state. That's how those two things come together, is that each state is responsible for protecting the basic rights of its own members. Now, sometimes this kind of basic rights protection relationship breaks down. States fail to protect the rights of their members. And this can be due to their sort of unwillingness in cases like persecution, but it can also be due to their inability in cases of sort of failed governance, if you like, or severe instances of extreme weather or something like that as well. And I think in these kinds of cases that those who are displaced outside of their country, outside of their state of origin, need to seek protection from the international community. They have just as valid a claim, a moral claim to refugee status as those displaced through persecution in the more classic sense of the refugee regime. So that's why these other kinds of cases that you mentioned, like people fleeing gang violence in the Northern Triangle, or people fleeing food insecurity and drought in East Africa, might have a claim to refugee status on the view that I defend in the book. Now, one thing that's important about this view is that what it says doesn't depend on the cause of somebody's displacement, right? So if somebody is displaced outside of their state of origin and their state is in a position where it's unable or unwilling to protect their basic rights on a kind of ongoing basis, then responsibility falls to the international community. And that's why they should count as a refugee. But this doesn't say anything about the causes of that situation that person's in. So although there are certainly these ways in which climate change can lead to people being in this situation where they can't avail themselves of the protection that their state ought to provide them, and so responsibility falls to the international community, nothing depends on climate change playing a causal role here. So that's the kind of picture that I try and set out in the chapter on the refugee regime.
So shifting the focus from causes to consequences then.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, well, the final context you discuss is internal displacement. Many people overlook the fact that a majority of those displaced by the impacts of climate change are displaced internally, or within their country's borders. The legal term used to describe these individuals is internally displaced persons, or IDPs for short. The example you used to illustrate this point is Typhoon Haiyan, which hit the Philippines in 2013, internally displacing around 4 million people. Some of our listeners might remember the awful scenes on the ground in the aftermath of this tragedy. Evacuation centres were overcrowded and makeshift shelters had to be set up in schools. But still, the vast majority of people were left outside without adequate shelter. So in circumstances like these, where an extreme weather event leaves entire communities without shelter, do you believe the international community has a collective duty to support and protect these internally displaced persons? And what kind of support would the international community have a duty to provide?
When it comes to the protection of internally displaced persons, at the moment, under sort of international legal and humanitarian frameworks, this is primarily understood as being a duty that national governments owe to their own citizens. And I think that, at first glance at least, makes perfectly good sense, right? What I said before about the way that responsibilities are distributed within the international order suggests that states have a kind of primary responsibility to protect the basic rights of their own citizens. And if their citizens are displaced internally, then it looks like it's their responsibility. But I do argue in the chapter that ultimately the international community does have a kind of second-order duty to supplement the protection by national governments of IDPs within their jurisdiction. And the reason for that is that I think if we're really committed to this idea that each state should be the guarantor of the basic rights of its own citizens, then we need to recognize that in many circumstances, some states will face incredible pressure on their capacity to protect their citizens' basic rights. And when they do face that pressure, it's important for them to be able to call on assistance from other states in the international order to make sure that that protection is secure. Otherwise, we end up in situations where people have to seek protection abroad as refugees, for example. And so if this is another part, I think another face of the international community's collective duty to ensure that basic human rights are protected throughout the globe. That kind of rationale for thinking that the international community as a whole has a kind of collective responsibility to help states facing exigent circumstances which make it hard to protect IDPs within their jurisdiction, that story doesn't depend on climate change being the cause of displacement. Now, we might talk in a little bit about the difference that climate change makes to responsibility sharing in these kinds of cases. But I do think that even in the absence of climate change, let's say in the case of a volcanic eruption or something that's not climate related, then I think in this case too, if the kind of threat to basic rights is severe and the state is facing significant pressure on its resources, then there is a kind of good case to be made for the international community having a duty to assist. Now, that's not a duty to step in and take the place of the state, right? So it's not about boots on the ground, if you like. It's about assisting through financial and technical resources states that are willing to protect the basic rights of their own citizens. Now, sometimes states do this informally through disaster relief, aid, and this kind of thing. But at the moment, that funding is not directed on anything like principle of need, right? It's directed according to the economic interests of donor countries, according to geographical and linguistic proximity, all these kinds of factors, which are not, I don't think, the most morally relevant factors when it comes to determining how disaster relief aid should be distributed at the global level. So I do try and argue that we should try and, if you like, firm up at the international level commitments for distributing disaster relief aid, redistributing between states to ensure that states can protect the basic rights of their own citizens in these extreme weather event circumstances.
Yeah, I really like this idea of distributing disaster relief between states to ensure the most vulnerable are able to manage extreme weather events. It seems like a fair way of holding high emitter states responsible for their contributions to climate change. An interesting thing about climate displacement is that it throws a spanner in the works of traditional arguments for closed borders. One of these arguments I call the go back where they came from argument. In a nutshell, this argument states that host states do not have a moral obligation to grant immigrants entry because they do not causally contribute to these immigrants having to leave their home state, and that these immigrants can, therefore, go back where they came from. Now, I know this is a harsh form of what proponents for closed borders argue, maybe a more colloquial way of putting things. But even on a softer reading, this argument does not seem to hold in the case of climate displacement, because host states do causally contribute to immigrants having to leave their home state, and therefore do bear some responsibility for rectifying the consequences of this form of displacement, especially in contexts like Tuvalu, where migrants might not have a home state to go back to. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this argument.
I don't know about you, but I'm really pulled by this intuition that those who are responsible for creating some kind of moral mess ought to be the ones held responsible for cleaning that mess up.
I would agree.
It's a very straightforward way of putting it, I think, but it's a powerful point about climate displacement is that it's not a kind of natural phenomenon, right? This is something that is the result of anthropogenic climate change for which people are responsible and not equally responsible, right? Some people, communities, states have a far bigger role in climate change than others. And I do think that should be reflected in how we respond to climate displacement. Now, what I argue in the book is that this might not make a huge difference when it comes to the rights that particular people have on the ground, if you like, in different situations of climate displacement. So just because somebody was displaced by climate change doesn't mean that they have a better claim to protection than somebody who was displaced by, let's say, poverty or war. But it might make a difference when it comes to how we should share the costs of responding to displacement at the international level, if you like. So there are some states that are going to face significant pressure in protecting their own citizens' basic rights, perhaps the basic rights of those who flee across borders into their country as a result of climate change impacts. And I think there's a case to be made, if you like, for redistributing those costs at the international level in line with responsibility for climate change. So states that are historically and continue to be to this day disproportionately responsible for climate change through their greenhouse gas emissions should be held responsible for bearing the costs of addressing the negative consequences of climate change, including climate displacement. So one other thing you mentioned was this idea that of what you call the go back where they came from argument, right? That if we're not responsible, then it's not our job, if you like, to admit refugees. So I do think that, so I think the first thing I should say is I never found, I guess, this argument the most compelling one in the first place. But that's because I have this kind of collective understanding of the duties of the international community as a whole and guaranteeing basic rights and so on. So I think it's harder than that for states to kind of justify the claim that they have no responsibility beyond their borders. But that being said, I do think it makes a kind of powerful difference to the way that people do think about this in practice, right? So if you think about cases like British involvement in Afghanistan, right? And when it comes to thinking about the special duties that we owe to interpreters who worked with the British military in Afghanistan, right? We think, look, our responsibility for our military engagements abroad mean that we owe a special duty to these people above and beyond the duty that we might owe to anybody else in a kind of similar position. So there is a kind of powerful pull, I think, to responsibility that being kind of causally implicated in somebody's displacement imposes upon us a kind of special duty to ensure that their basic rights are protected. I think that duty is probably best institutionalized through something like a global redistributive structure, which compensates the states who actually do the first order protection, if you like, rather than saying that this means that high emitters have to get kind of operationally involved in protecting people displaced by extreme weather events in the Philippines, for example. I think that's properly understood as the kind of responsibility of national governments in most cases of internal movement, at least. But just because the movement takes place within one place doesn't mean the cost should stay there as well. The costs can be redistributed at the kind of global level. It's complicated to figure out exactly what those costs are, especially given this kind of causal complexity. But I think a kind of rough justice is appropriate here, right? We can do with approximations and sort of large-scale redistribution here as a way of roughly compensating those states or governments or organizations that end up taking on costs in the process of protecting people displaced by the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, and I think, even though the practical application might be complicated, the moral intuition speaks to a kind of common sense morality that parents teach their children, which is that you should clean up your own mess, right?
Exactly, yeah. That's a nice turn of phrase, I think, for it.
Well, Jamie, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great chatting about your book now that it's been released. I think it's a really interesting area of work.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really nice.
If you're interested in the deeper philosophical questions around climate displacement, subscribe to our newsletter for an extended interview, where Jamie and I discuss climate gentrification and the reasons why it's important to remain optimistic.